everyone ready? If everyone's ready, I'll start the time now. Francesca and I affirm, resolve the European Union to join the Belt and Road Initiative. Our sole contention concerns unlocking the gates of Eurasia. Central Asia suffers from the worst development outcomes in the world. Russell of the European Parliamentary Research Service in 2019 writes that Central Asian countries are poorly connected to each other and the rest of the world. The region's isolation is a major barrier to modernization. Hoffman of Paris University in 2014 quantifies that the reality in Central Asia is that poverty concerns the majority of the population. Opening up trade is vital for these countries. Freund at the Peterson Institute in 2019 explains that since 1990, more than 1 billion people have lifted themselves out of poverty owing to growth that was underpinned by trade. Open trade is particularly beneficial to the poor because it reduces the cost of what they buy and raises the price of what they sell. Current EU efforts in Central Asia are failing, as Krusman of the LSE in 2019 writes that the EU's efforts to increase connectivity with Central Asia are likely to be heavily restricted by China and Russia's influence being the main actors in the region. In fact, China's Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, has gained traction in the region. Hashimova of The Diplomat in 2018 furthers that for Central Asian states, the BRI serves as a global trade reorientation towards Western Europe and beyond. They hope that it will unite the region and open doors for larger projects with global attention. Fortunately, through joining the BRI, the European Union can help Central Asia reach its full economic potential, promoting trade in 2 ways. First is promoting regional integration. In the status quo, Lynn of the Brookings Institute in 2016 reports that average trade costs in Central Asia are about twice than normal due to delays in cost of border crossings and poor logistics and excess fees. The EU has the tools to change this. The EU Commission in 2018 reports the EU has placed regional integration as one of its priorities for development cooperation by developing free trade areas, simplifying customs procedures, making it easier to move goods across borders. However, the BRI is a necessary vehicle to achieve these goals. Turkstra of the University of Melbourne in 2018 explains that through the BRI, the EU can complement Chinese efforts by strengthening the equally important regulatory frameworks needed to realize the great connectivity potential of Central Asia. Regional integration opens the door to prosperous trade. Lin furthers that effective regional cooperation for Central Asia could lead to a possible doubling of regional GDP over 10 years through a reduction in trade costs. Overall, the UN in 2013 quantifies regional cooperation in Central Asia will help lift tens of millions of people out of poverty. The second way the EU can help is by opening up its markets. Today, Cora of the University of Feinberg in 2018 explains that for the EU, many BRI countries, especially in Central Asia, are white spots on its trade map. Fortunately, the BRI is an opportunity for Central Asia to reconnect to its neighbor. Engvall, the Institute for Development in 2017 concurs that Central Asian countries will be as interested as China in reaching the European market, seeking to adapt the new Silk Road to serve their interests. Cole of the Cambridge Journal in 2019 furthers that the BRI creates transportation infrastructure that reduces travel times and agreements that reduce tariffs, ultimately increasing trade. Importantly, the European Institute for Asian Studies reports in 2017 that the world needs the EU to join the BRI for the initiative to reach its maximum potential. Without it, the world's largest market would remain unconnected. The benefits would be immense. As Gamal, the IMF in 2018 writes, trade between China and Europe that transits through Central Asia could be tapped to integrate those countries into global value chains, allowing for a diversification of exports. As such, the Maritime Executive in 2019 quantifies, if completed, the BRI will raise Central Asian GDP by 18% by 2040. In conclusion, Lagarde of the IMF in 2019 writes that rebuilding the Silk Road can play a role in Central Asia's quest for inclusive growth, ultimately raising living standards and providing new chances for millions. Thus, Francesca and I are proud to affirm.
Renegade. Contention 1 is Eurozone collapse. If the EU joined the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, support for anti-EU populist parties would surge for 2 reasons. First is xenophobia. Trixkis 18 explains the BRI will trigger populist backlash to Chinese expansionism, especially as COM19 adds 89% of BRI contractors use Chinese workers. Second is economic fear. Detmer 19 reports populists oppose the BRI because Chinese firms will compete with local businesses. Asimoglu 18 quantifies, increasing Chinese imports by 133 euros per worker increases the vote share of populists by 3.7%. Countries that have joined the BRI are already seeing populist backlash. Chatsky19 writes that populists have run and won off of an anti-China platform in Malaysia. After Italy joined the BRI, populists gained strength in the polls. The impact is collapsing the EU. Grab16 explains that right-wing populism threatens the EU because the populist platform runs opposite to European integration. Winchester19 writes that just one more major country leaving the EU would likely collapse the Eurozone, because it would both weaken the euro and undermine investor and nation confidence in the single currency. Critically, Reader 11 furthers, collapse of the Eurozone would lead to an economic crisis that would trigger a global depression. Bradform 13 finds that a global recession would push 900 million people into poverty. Contention 2 is collapsing NATO. Europe electing to join China in the BRI would lead to the destruction of NATO for 3 reasons. The first is American backlash. The BRI forces the EU to choose between the US and China in a way Trump cannot ignore. Chan16 writes that China has been using the BRI to separate the EU from the US. Walt16 writes that because China is not a threat to Europe, they will be eager to invest in China and sell sophisticated NATO weaponry to it. He furthers that in such a case, the US would be reluctant to subsidize Europe's defense. US withdrawal destroys the alliance. The Economist writes in 2019 that absent US participation in NATO, there would be gaps in military capabilities, and establishing a European defense would overwhelm Europe politically, financially, and militarily. Second is fracturing from within. Right 18 writes that Beijing knows dividing the US and EU would be crucial to isolating and countering America. The BRI allows China to work within the EU to destroy NATO. Lute 19 explains that as part of the BRI, China will gain political influence within EU governments, widening political divisions within NATO and eroding cohesion. By leveraging its newfound power over key EU governments in NATO, such as Germany and France, China will be able to increase political divisions over issues such as human rights, fracturing the NATO alliance. Third is ports. Johnson 15 writes that port deals associated with the BRI threaten to politically hive off vulnerable members of an already tottering European Union. LaCour 19 continues, Europe has to grapple with Chinese ownership or control over physical infrastructure and the security risks that arise from it. Brandenburg 19 adds Chinese-controlled infrastructure could restrict U.S. military operations in Europe, which is why LaCour concludes the use of European ports for U.S. and NATO operations would be compromised under the BRI. The impact is an Eastern European war. O'Sullivan 98 writes, NATO's Article 5 Mutual Defense Clause makes any threat futile or even counterproductive. Skull 16 corroborates NATO's 28-country coalition is the one single bloc standing in the way of any expansionist desires Putin might be harboring. Putin, if given the opportunity, would invade countries like Bulgaria, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Slovenia, and a handful of other countries that were once under the control of the Soviet Union. Indeed, Fisherman's 15 concludes that a Russian invasion of Eastern Europe would kill millions. Thus, we urge you to negate.
So can you name to me one populist group in Europe?
The Northern League,
Can you name to me a second one?
like AFD.
Okay, so where are those?
Northern League's in Italy, AFD's in Germany.
So I would say that like when Italy joined the BRI, you say they increased like populism, right?
Yeah.
Wasn't Italy already populist?
No, so the Italian government was a coalition between the Five-Star Movement and the Northern League. So the Northern League actually opposes the BRI, but the Five-Star Movement supports it. But
That's
the
not the
Five-Star
question.
Movement is not populist.
So, but the other movement was.
The Northern League?
Yeah.
Yes, but they didn't.
Okay, so there's already populism in the country, right?
Yeah.
So like, how can you be sure that like the BRI was the unique reason why populism
Okay,
increased?
so our unique, oh, sorry, like in these countries?
Yeah, in Italy, like.
Yeah,
I
so
mean,
we
there's
tell
no other example.
because of the ones we give you, where we tell you that these countries are extremely anti-China. And we tell you, like, for
Okay, no,
example,
that's not-
the
that's
Populist
the-
Party in
that's
Malaysia,
not
for
answering the
example,
question.
had an anti-China platform and an anti-BRI platform, and they won off of that platform.
Okay, can you give me another example of an EU country that's like turned populist?
But why? You want me to just keep listing countries that have turned populist?
Can you?
Yeah, Hungary and Greece.
Is the BRI in there?
Yes. Can I ask you a question?
Okay.
Let's talk about your argument about Eurasia, right?
Yeah.
Is your argument that the European, like the EU as a government goes in, or is it that private companies go in, like build this cooperation?
The EU.
Okay, so what does the EU have? So what technology does like the European Union government possess that private companies or like individual countries don't have?
What do you mean?
Because you make this argument where you say that the EU has tools to support regional integration, right?
Yeah.
So what tools are you talking about?
Okay, you even read in your case, like at the bottom of populism, that like it's going to decrease like regional integration within Europe, right? So the EU is a collection of, right? The EU is a collection of states that work together to trade, like between borders, right? We tell you that the EU, with this expertise in mind, is going to go into Central Asia and spread that knowledge.
So your argument is that the EU has knowledge that people influence that
They're gonna-
China don't have now, and then they spread
They're
it.
going to like increase things like FTAs and like decrease like the price of customs, right? That's the EU Commission card, who's really specific, that tells you that one of their top priorities is like increasing regional integration.
So only the EU knows how to sign a free trade agreement?
I would tell you that of like every like area in like the world, the EU is one of the only places that is a group of collective countries who across borders trade with each other and have incredible regional cooperation,
Is your
right?
argument-
And they're also one of the only nations whose top priority is to increase regional cooperation.
Is your argument that they have some kind of special knowledge or innovation that China doesn't have right now? Or is your argument just that when they join, they
In the,
sign free trade
in the
agreements?
status quo, with like Chinese investment, Lin is super specific and tells you that trade costs 2 times more there than any other region
Okay.
because they lack regional cooperation. China right now isn't implementing regional cooperation, but we tell you through the Turkstra evidence, which is really specific, that when the EU goes in and complements Chinese hard infrastructure with soft infrastructure like regional integration, that's when you see like the GDP increase by double.
So your argument is about innovation
No,
or like regional cooperation.
regional cooperation.
So it's just that the EU cooperates with China, and this is really good.
No, that's not at all what I'm saying. They're going to implement things like FTAs and like decrease the cost of crossing borders, right? That's what we've been talking about for the past 2 minutes.
But how do they decrease the cost of crossing borders? Do they implement some kind of innovation?
Not innovation, but like policies. You can call for the cards.
Okay.
It's fine.
Is everyone ready?
Cool.
Time begins now. Go to their first contention when they talk about an increase in populism. You have to ask yourself a couple of questions. It's very unclear and very unspecific. What countries specifically get more populous? They can't give you a single card of when a country has joined the BRI, specifically in the European Union, that populism has increased. We would say their example with Italy is very, very bad. The reasoning why it's bad is because Italy was already populous before it joined the BRI. That's what they can't give an example of directly. Because of the BRI, it has led to more populism. That means it's like literally not like the causality issues there. But then what we would explain to you is also they don't prove like how many more countries have to like leave the European Union in order to be a recession happening. You have to prove like there's going to be a majority in them leaving, because their extension of why there's going to be a recession is very, very unclear. As to just one country leaving means that there's going to be a recession. There's no terminalization of this. But then third of all, what we say is there's also going to be so many other reasons why populism increases in the European Union. For example, border control and refugees. We would say it's not directly because of the Belt and Road Initiative. If they don't like say it's specifically because of this, then it means they literally can't win their impact here. But then, go into their second contention when they talk about NATO. On their first warrant, they talk about American backlash. Again, very unclear and very unspecific. But what we would explain to you is Harding 18 furthers that NATO was established by a formal and binding treaty, so Trump cannot use his executive power to pull America out of the alliance. He would need to win an approval in the Senate, and that would never happen, as Hill 18 writes that the Senate overwhelmingly voted in favor of a motion supporting NATO with a 97-2 vote. The reason why this is critical is because Politico 19 says that the U.S. actually wants to increase funding now and increase its commitment towards NATO. They don't say how angry the United States has to be in order for them to pull out of NATO. They don't just say like there's going to be less sharing of like tech and all this stuff, but they don't say how much more less sharing of tech means that there's also going to be an increasing amount of militarization. Very unclear. But then secondly, they say it's fracturing within, and specifically in the European Union. But what we do explain to you is the main reason why there's fracturing within right now is specifically because the European Union states don't know if they should join as a bloc or as independent nations right now. When you saw back for the root cause of that and join as a bloc, for example, like Germany and France only want to join as a bloc, it means that you decrease the risk of fracturing within. But secondly, they don't explain how much more fracturing within is going to cause as a direct result of this. There's no like contextualization at all of how much this actually increases the risk that NATO is going to collapse. But then their third warning is that there's going to be like this like increase in like China taking over the ports. But then first we'd say that like European Union still has a major access over these ports. If they're going to be like a major part of the initiative, they can tell China not to go into a port area. It makes a lot of sense. They're not going to let them just like take over the whole European Union. It doesn't make any sense there. But then second of all, they don't explain how much this is actually hurt NATO when you have more ports going to China. There's no contextualization there as well. Very unclear. But then we would say a turn on their case on Russia is that without NATO, Russia has no incentive to expand westward. Without NATO, Estonia, Latvia, etc. are meaningless, weak states who pose no threat to Russia's national security compared to when they're a part of NATO, a regional alliance which was created for the purpose of sole containing Russian aggression. This reason is explained by Mearsheimer 14 of Foreign Policy, who gives the example of Russia's invasion of Crimea, something that only happened because of the West's efforts to integrate Ukraine into NATO. You should prefer this turn over the argument because taking NATO out of the equation solves that for the root cause of Russian aggression. So if you actually decrease their reliance on NATO actually used, it means it's a lot easier to decrease the amount of Russian aggression. But then, the reason why we're going to be outweighing their entire case is a couple reasons. First is on uniqueness. We would explain to you there are so many other factors why populism increases. There are so many other reasons why NATO could actually break down. However, our authors indicate that the only way that you can actually shift Central Asia out of a poverty trap is by actually increasing their economies through the Belt and Road Initiative when the European Union joins. But then second of all, what we would explain to you is their impacts are very uncontextualized and very not explained at all. We give you a very clear link story when we explain to you that we lift tens of millions of people out of poverty and increase the GDP in the Central Asia by 2 times and increase it on our second ward by 18%. Don't vote for something that you don't know what happens, and don't vote for something where they can't answer the questions that I asked.
We're going to run a little bit of time. All right, for order, I'm going to start on our C1, and then I'll go over to their case. Is everyone ready? On our first contention about populism, our argument is when the EU as a whole joins the Belt and Road Initiative, that enrages people in Europe, because most of them will see this as a Chinese encroachment onto Europe, which increases support for populist candidates. They give you a few responses. First, they say the argument is really unclear, because we're not telling you which countries will have populism. Our argument is about A, the countries that haven't joined the Belt and Road Initiative yet, like Germany and France, they're going to see populist backlash, but B, the populists in other countries like Italy that have already joined the Belt and Road Initiative suddenly become even more anti-European Union, because now the European Union is the one that's joining the Belt and Road Initiative, not the other countries. Next, they say that we don't read any evidence saying that when countries join, there's a rise in populism. We tell you that from Malaysia and other Southeast Asian countries, our evidence is explicit. The BRI fueled a rise of populism, and they've actually, populists have won in Malaysia. And in Italy, even though Italy joined recently, when their 5-star regime has joined the Belt and Road Initiative, populists saw significant increases in their poll numbers. That's the evidence we read in case. Next, they say that if Italy was populist when they joined, and nothing has changed. But the distinction in our case is very important. The government in Italy right now is a coalition between the 5-star movement and the Northern League. The 5-star movement is not populist and supports the Belt and Road Initiative. The Northern League is populist and opposes it. Our argument is support for the 5-star movement went down and support for the Northern League went up when Italy joined the Belt and Road Initiative, and that has made Italy more populist and more likely to leave the European Union. The same is true for the rest of the countries. Next, they say that we need to contextualize how many more countries need to leave for a recession to actually happen. Our evidence is very specific. It says one more country needs to leave. And the warranting for that is also in our case. We tell you that investor confidence is very low right now as a result of Britain leaving. One more country tips us over. Investors don't believe in the euro anymore, and the Eurozone collapses. That triggers our impacts from happening. Then they say there are many other reasons for why populists are really strong. Yes, that's true, but the causal evidence is in our case. We tell you an increase in 133 euros per worker of Chinese imports increases the vote share of right-wing protectionist parties by 3.7 percentage points. Yes, there are other factors, but we make it worse through our own warrants. That's what triggers the collapse. Then on the way, they say they outweigh on uniqueness. Well, I'll get to why this outweighs their case later, but if we win risk of our argument being true, you should vote here. Next, they say that there's no contextualization, but our argument in case is that if the Eurozone collapses, that leads to a global depression, because it means that the entire currency of the entire European Union is gone, investors flee the region, and that causes a global depression. This outweighs their case for a few reasons. First is that if there's a global depression, then there's not going to be any funds for Belt and Road Initiative projects, either from China or the European Union, which means none of their impacts can happen. Second, if populists gain power in the European Union, that means these populists can block the BRI projects from ever happening in the first place, because the populists oppose the Belt and Road Initiative and don't want to make these funds into foreign countries. But third, because populists are very nationalistic and don't believe in helping foreign countries, that means the European Union aid as a whole, not just infrastructure aid to Central Asia, is going to go down, which means that outweighs their case there. On our second contention, we'll concede all the dealings on NATO. NATO's not going to collapse. They don't get offense on their turn. Let's go over to my opponent's case. Start with 2 overviews. First of all, 22 out of 28 European Union nations have already joined the Belt and Road Initiative. This is very important because none of their impacts are actually happening. There's no cohesion there. They have to prove the significant increase in cohesion when these countries join. Second overview comes from Bradbury 18, who writes that the European Union right now has a $500 billion infrastructure plan designed to collaborate with the Belt and Road Initiative within the European Union and in other foreign countries. The problem is this plan is a lot better than the Belt and Road Initiative. A, because the European Union doesn't use debt trap diplomacy like China, and B, because the European Union doesn't believe in the deployment of fossil fuels like China does. But we'd say that this plan would come if the European Union joined the Belt and Road Initiative, this plan would get defunded, and that money would go to the Belt and Road for 3 reasons. First, because there's limited funds in the European Union because they're on the verge of recession. Secondly, because the European plan is literally designed to compete with the Belt and Road Initiative. And third, because of politics, there's only a limited amount of money that can be feasibly spent through political discussions on things like infrastructure. Let's go on their specific warrants. First, they say that on their first warrant, they say that the European Union is going to facilitate all this trade within these European countries. Problem here is, why aren't they doing that right now? If it was so profitable and it would increase trade, they could collaborate with China right now, at least the countries that have already joined the Belt and Road Initiative, and their impact should already be happening. You don't need every European country in order to do this. On their second warrant, you can turn the argument against them. More trade means strong EU multinational corporations outcompete local firms in these regions and crush the local economy because the multinational corporations repatriate their profits at home, which means money is going to be transferred from Central Asia over to the European Union. Alright, You can have first question.
Okay. You say 22 out of 28
Yeah.
EU countries have already joined, right?
Yeah.
So why has one of them not left because of an increase in populism?
So the reasons when people read this response, the front lines we give is, first of all, that these populists don't necessarily oppose the European Union, they just oppose the BRI, but then you tie the two together when the European Union joins. Second of all, you unite all the populists that currently exist against the European Union because they think the EU is selling themselves out to China.
That makes no sense. You just said that when countries join, they don't like. You're saying when countries join, they only oppose it when it's the EU joining?
So they oppose the BRI, but they don't necessarily oppose the EU for that reason. Because if Greece joins the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, then Greek populists are angry about that, but they're not angry about the EU. They're at the EU. They're angry at Greece.
Which countries, though? Wait, that doesn't make any sense, though, because the countries that haven't joined yet are like Western European countries. You said that they want to join as a bloc. So obviously populism wouldn't increase there, and they wouldn't be mad at the European Union if the few remaining states want to join as a whole coalition.
No, so the argument is that the resolution is the EU should join the Belt and Road Initiative,
Yeah.
right? So the EU is going to sign a memorandum of understanding or something like that with China. And populists across the European Union say the EU is selling you out. They're allowing China to take over our economy.
Wait, but
and that creates a backlash.
but couldn't they say that no matter what? Couldn't they say like in the countries, like your country's selling you out, so
Yes.
like we're gonna lead as a country?
Well, okay, but there's no reason why Greece would leave the EU if Greece decided to join the BRI and populists in Greece don't
So
want that.
which countries that still haven't joined are on the risk of a like populism overtaking?
Oh, like all of them. Populism is fairly strong in Europe right now.
No, which ones that haven't joined the Belt and Road
In Germany,
Initiative?
the AfD is quite strong and it's increasing support. In France, Marine Le Pen's party has
How
an
much?
increasing
But
share of votes
how
for
much
Sure
more
right
does
now.
it increase as a direct result of directly joining the BRI? Like hasn't the thing the populist movement in Germany actually increased as a direct result of like refugee crisis?
Well, yeah, there are of course other factors, but
Yeah,
first
so
of all,
why hasn't that triggered? Like, why is the BRI so much of a bigger deal than things like border control or refugee crisis?
two things. One is the Acemoglu evidence that says that every 133 euros of imports increases populism empirically by 3.7%. Like that's the
What does that
first
mean?
thing. That if you increase the amount of interconnectivity, increase the Chinese presence in Europe, that empirically boosts right-wing populism. The second thing,
Like,
yeah.
okay, yeah, you can, yeah.
Yeah, the second thing with that is that wait, what was your question? Sorry, I just lost my train of thought there.
No, I was just asking, like, there are other, like, reasons why populism could increase. Like, why is the BRI so much different and so much stronger than these other reasons?
So one, this BRI means that the populists all oppose the European Union and use them as their target. But secondly, like, these reasons will exist in either world. Our argument is the
Wait, but if the
uniqueness.
European Union agrees to take in, like, refugees or stuff like that, couldn't they oppose them as well?
Well, A, the EU hasn't done that, and B, it's scalar. The more populism there is, the worse it is, and the higher chances,
I'm
given
just
that there are
like really
28 countries in the
confused
EU,
what
the higher
exactly
chances
the
that
bright
one
line
lose.
of how much populism exactly has to increase,
Well,
like the exact amount in order for them to leave the European
We read
Union.
empirical evidence about how much it increases, and there are 28 countries. If populists get a strong majority in one of them and they're anti-EU, they can pull
Why
out.
does just okay, yeah.
Okay. I'm going to be starting off on our case, their case, and then way. Okay, is everyone ready? Great. Starting off our contention when talking about Eurasia, remember Russell who tells you that Central Asia is poorly connected to the rest of the world and poverty concerns the majority of people there. They're living in the worst of the worst circumstances and have no trade. And Kruseman tells you the reason why the EU can't break into the market right now is because they're restricted by Russia and China. The only way you change this is by having the EU sign onto the BRI with China, which means they can work with China to improve the economies of Central Asia. They say 22 out of 28 states have joined the BRI. This delinks them from their entire populism argument, because if 22 out of 28 states have joined the BRI and there's literally no increase in populism in Europe other than perhaps one state, they literally don't have any access and any probability on their argument. They delink themselves here. But second, I would say, like, those states aren't trading or doing anything with the EU, but our second warrant is reliant on trading with the EU, because when China trades with the EU, you have to go through Central Asia, which increases infrastructure. But then they try and read this argument about how $500 billion plan from the EU. One, the card isn't about Central Asia, so that means like it doesn't respond to our case at all. But second, it's not mutually exclusive with the BRI. But then, going on to our second warrant talking about open markets, Cora tells you that Central Asia is a white spot on the trade map for the EU. But what's really important is the Engval card, who tells you that Central Asia wants to trade with the EU and the EU wants to trade with Central Asia. But the only way this happens is when they sign onto the BRI. And Cole tells you that transportation infrastructure that goes through Central Asia is really, really good because it connects Central Asia to global markets and global value chains. The Maritime Express implicates this by telling you it's going to increase Central Asian GDP by 18% and take millions of people out of poverty. Their only response is that there's going to be more multinational corporations, but one, it's totally an analytic, and two, there's literally no context at all, and also we're not talking about multinational corporations, we're talking about trade. But then, going on to their case, starting off on this idea about populism, it's really unclear and it's really unspecific. They have literally no evidence on any European state saying the cause of populism is from the BRI. They have no evidence on Italy. It's just their own imagination talking about it. Italy was already populist. They have literally no cards. But then also what's really important is we tell you that there's other reasons that populism can increase. I would say that they can't ever isolate that populism because of the BRI is going to be the tipping point. That's really important. But then we also tell you how many states have to leave the EU to trigger a recession. We would tell you the EU's economy is really, really strong right now. The EU Commission 19.5 that Europe is already the world's largest exporter, is the biggest exporter market for 80 countries, accounting for 16% of global trade. And in the past 20 years, their trade doubled. If their economy is really strong, then I will tell you why one nation leaving is going to cause the recession. The impact is super small. They do some weighing saying that that populist states are going to block the BRI in Central Asia. If the EU wants to be part of the BRI with Central Asia, and Central Asia wants to be part of the BRI with the EU, then I would say they're never going to block this. But let's do some weighing. One is on uniqueness. Populism can happen in numerous ways. They never isolate why the BRI is unique, but the only way you fundamentally change the economies of Central Asia is by having the EU go in and trade with them. But second, I would say when you don't have economic growth in Central Asia, there's going to be political unrest and violence, which means there could be more violence in the region and more instability, which might lead to a refugee crisis, which increases populism in Europe. I would say the best way to solve that for any increase in populism is to increase the economies of Central Asia.
Is everybody ready? I'm going to start on weighing, and then I'll go to the next, and then I'll go to the end. So everyone good? Start on weighing. They don't respond to Inco's weighing and rebuttal, where he tells you that populism short-circuits the link into this Eurasian cooperation. He gives you three reasons. One, he says that if a global depression happens, there's no funds to make any of this cooperation happen. Secondly, he tells you that populists would block future Belt and Road Initiative projects because they strongly oppose it. And finally, that populists are extremely nationalist and oppose cooperation. They give you two responses. One, they say that the European Union really wants trade. Sure, maybe they want trade right now, but once populists take over the government, because they're pro-protectionism and anti-trade and anti-foreign governments, that means that they rip up the BRI and this cooperation never happens. Then they tell you that some argue about how populism in economic growth controls populism in Central Asia, but our argument is not about Central Asia. Our argument is about the actor in this resolution, which is the European Union. We say that as long as populism goes up in the European Union, this cooperation never happens, which means none of their impacts trigger if we're winning the link into populism. This means that if we're winning our first contention about populism, this short circuits their case, because their case simply never happens if a populist government takes over Europe. With that in mind, let's go to our case. On our contention about populism, our argument is that when the European Union joins the Belt and Road Initiative, this inflames populists across the European Union, which then gains strength in the polls because A, people fear the economic leverage China is going to gain and Chinese imports stealing their jobs, and secondly, we say that they fear foreign expansion. They give you a couple of responses. One, they say we give you no evidence, but we've given you pretty clear evidence from case that in Malaysia, for example, populists ran off of an anti-Belt and Road Initiative campaign and they managed to win. We also tell you in Italy, populists gained strength in the polls after Italy joined the Belt and Road Initiative because of their opposition. Their second response is that there's other reasons it goes up. Sure, but those other reasons don't change in either world. Our world is the only one that's giving you a unique reason why populism goes up. Then they tell you the European economy is strong, but they're not engaging with our internal war, which is the Winchester 19 evidence that tells you that Brexit has actually left investor confidence in the European Union extremely low. That's why the Winchester 19 evidence, which goes completely conceded, tells you that if just one more country or major economy leaves the European Union, this would be enough to topple the European Union and send the world into a global recession that puts 900 million people into poverty. The other response they make is they say, if 22 countries have already joined, why haven't we seen this populism? First of all, we've seen it in Italy rise up. That's literally our case. But secondly, we tell you that the unique thing that happens when the EU joins is that it unites the anti-EU parties and the anti-populist parties. Right now, when a country joins the Belt and Road Initiative, the populists in that country blame the specific country. But we say, when the European Union forces these Western European economies to join the Belt and Road Initiative, this unites Eurosceptics and the populists, which dramatically increases the strength of these populist parties and dramatically increases the chance that these parties are overthrown. With that in mind, let's go to their case. They mishandle Inco's overview, which really takes out their case. What he tells you is that right now, the European Union already has a $500 billion infrastructure plan that China is cooperating with that gets completely traded off with the Belt and Road Initiative. This is a completely conceited turn. The only response they give you is that it's not mutually exclusive, but they don't engage with the 3 warns Inco gives you for why they are mutually exclusive. One, he tells you there's limited funds. Second, that the European Union made this project to compete with the Belt and Road Initiative. And finally, there's not enough political capital. The reason this is important because it means there's no unique offense on their side, because any funding increase they impact you, it simply trades off with existing funding, and we tell you that this funding is actually better because there's no debt trap diplomacy involved. Thus, we urge you to negate.
Okay, you guys can ask their question.
So what's your card saying that because of the BRI, populism in Italy increased? Like, what's the card name? Just give us the card name.
Okay, so the evidence, there's 2 pieces of evidence. One is that because of the BRI, populism increased in Malaysia, and the second piece of evidence is that when Italy signed the BRI, separate piece of evidence, populist poll numbers went up. We don't have evidence.
Okay, we asked for a card in the beginning of the round saying that when they signed onto the BRI, populism increased. Does the second card you're saying say when they signed onto the BRI, populism increased?
No, it's like a polling chart. It says like.
It doesn't say that it was like because of the BRI.
No, it doesn't.
Okay, so
the
then how
evidence
can
that
you,
says
okay,
that
right?
is-
Wait, what is the date on that card?
Yeah.
Which sorry.
What is the date on
The
when
polling is just the most recent polling.
I don't know when that was.
Like, there's like, I mean, there's several, we have several articles about this. I guess one would be the August piece from the New York Times saying that Salvini's party, the Populist Party in Italy, is gaining strength.
Okay, but you just say it's like gaining strength, but literally you have no evidence at all that says it's because of the BRI. Like, it could be because like so many other factors.
That's where the Asimoglu evidence comes in. That tells you every 133 euro increase of Chinese imports increases right-wing populism by 3.7%.
What does that even mean?
Have there been any like EU imports into Italy?
Yeah,
Or
there have.
Chinese imports into Italy?
Yeah. Like,
So-
yeah, there's imports. Yeah, they trade. Yeah.
Okay, wait.
I'm confused.
Okay, wait. So, I'm just saying, right? So Italy's the only example you can give of like a nation in the EU joining onto the BRI that's increased populism. But you read in your rebuttal that 22 out of like whatever have joined onto the BRI. So what about the 21 other nations?
So the
Just give me
uniqueness,
one other one.
so the uniqueness that Matthew reads is that one, you unite the Eurosceptics with the people who oppose.
What
the
does that
Baltic
mean,
I don't
Ingo?
know.
What does that mean? Like, I really like don't. I don't know how to like contextualize like what the Eurosceptics and like the other people mean in terms of like increasing the amount of like populism support.
So we read this argument in summary. Our argument is that right now, when individual countries join the Belt and Road Initiative, the populists in that country who oppose the Belt and Road Initiative get really, really mad at that country. But our argument is that when
So,
the European Union
yeah.
joins the Belt and Road Initiative, right, and forces all these other countries to join, then they get really mad at
Like,
the
which
European
country?
Union for joining
Okay,
the
that's
Belt.
Like,
fine.
which
That's
country's
fine.
gonna
But
do that?
if that's true, why haven't we seen that in the 21 other nations you
Because
referenced?
the EU hasn't joined yet.
But
Our
you say
argument is there's
when
a lot
one
of-
nation like comes, they get mad at their government. So what's an example of another nation other than Italy that like the people have gotten mad at their government for signing on to the BRI?
There have been like protests against this everywhere. We
Where?
can give you specific
Where?
polling numbers, but
No.
there's definitely a lot of opposition to this.
Can you just give me an example other than Italy?
Yeah, we gave you an
Hungary
example
found
of Malaysia.
opposition.
What Malaysia? I've
Malaysia as
asked.
well.
We've
We
asked
asked
for an
for the
example
Hungary
of the
card,
European Union like 10
And
times.
you haven't given us
So
a
we
single
don't have
one.
a piece of evidence saying specifically in Hungary populism went up because of the BRI.
Because
What I'm telling you is-
populism was there before.
Populism was there before.
We're talking about the analytics here. Like,
But you can't like have analytics on like populism numbers going up when you can't give us an example of it. Like, you need a card saying that the BRI is the reason why populism increases, right? You can't just like assert
most
that.
of our uniqueness is, well, there's the Asimoglu evidence, but most of our uniqueness is that when the EU joins the bloc, that makes them these populist Eurosceptics.
Like how many? Okay. Our case weighing their case. Okay. Is everyone ready? Cool. Time goes down. Go to our first contention. We explain to you as Russell explains that Central Asia is poorly connected to the rest of the world. Hoffman explains that poverty concerns the majority of the population there. But then you can go to our second one that specifically explains to you that Engel says that the European Union is as interested in going to Central Asia as Central Asia is as going to the European Union. That responds to his way in saying the populists won't go into there. If literally Western Europe is so interested in going in, they're going to go in no matter what. That means it's ultimately, it comes down to the Krusman analysis that explains to you the only reason why they're being obstructed right now is because China and Russia are the major actors in the region. When you take them out of the region, it means specifically you can increase the amount of infrastructure development there. That's why specifically Cole explains to you an increased amount of transportation infrastructure, and then you go down to the Marion executive who explains that it increases the GDP by 18% and pulls millions out of poverty. He has one turn here. The only turn is about, there's this other plan that's going on. First, the plan isn't about Central Asia. It's not responsive to our case. But then second of all, he doesn't explain why you can't just integrate the plan into the BRI. There's no reason why you can't do this. He doesn't give any contextualization of how good the plan has actually been. We would explain to you the weighing is very simple here. First, on uniqueness, he gives so many other reasons as to why populism could have increased in the European Union. For example, border control, increase in refugees. He doesn't specify it to actually the BRI being the leading reason of why it is increased in the European Union, which means you literally can't vote for the argument. There is such a long link chain. One, BRI increases populism. Second, it means that they go into a global recession and all these other factors. However, you directly know that when you do this thing, you can specifically pull Central Asia out of poverty and increase their GDP by 18%. But then second of all, we link it to populism because when Central Asia has more instability and they have less trade routes, it means specifically that there can be an increase in violence outside of the EU nation, which means that it can increase populist supporters there as well, which is clean conceded as well. What we would explain to you at the end of the day is the EU Commission evidence, which postdates their evidence on the Brexit, which means that 1 Eurozone nation is going to collapse the whole entire thing. What it explains is trade is highest that it's ever been right now post-Brexit, which literally means that one nation pulling out doesn't mean that there's going to be a collapse of the whole Eurozone. There's very unspecific and very unclear about how much it needs to be an increase in populism in order for this full-on global recession to happen. The only thing that you know is you can develop the Central Asian economy, which is the most important thing based on magnitude because they're the most poor countries ever.
I'm going to start on the weighing, then our case, and then their case. Is everyone ready? Wait, sorry. Weighing, our case, their case. Okay. On the weighing they concede is that populists oppose these types of initiatives with the Belt and Road Initiative that increase connectivity, and they oppose increasing aid towards Central Asia. They say that right now Western Europe has an interest in increasing trade. That's because Western Europe right now isn't populist. But we tell you the populists oppose this type of trade because populists oppose integration and they're very nationalist and they fear other cultures. They never respond to this. We don't have to win a Eurozone collapse in order to short-circuit their argument. We just have to win that populism goes up and these populists gain a lot of political influence and they stop all of these projects from happening. With that, let's go to populism. They extend only two responses in final focus. First, they say that right now trade is incredibly high, which means the Eurozone collapse won't happen. The problem is, our evidence says it's about specifically the investor confidence within the euro. And we say that investor confidence within the euro is really low right now because Brexit just happened. It doesn't matter how trade is, but if one other country leaves the European Union, then investors think the euro is about to collapse. They pull out the euro, that collapses the euro and causes a global depression. The second thing they say is that they outweigh on uniqueness because our link chain is long, but they aren't extending responses to it into final focus. What our argument is that what happens is that there's a significant increase in populism when China enters Europe because there's an increase in xenophobia, and second of all, because people are afraid that the Chinese workers are going to take their jobs. That's why the Acemoglu evidence tells you that every 133 euro increase in Chinese imports increases populism by 3.7 percentage points. They never respond to this. It's a clear empirical link into populism. That means that what we tell you is that there's going to be a significant increase in populism, and you align the populists with the Eurosceptics within Europe. Secondly, when the European Union as a whole joins the Belt and Road Initiative, that means that it short circuits their entire case. Let's go over to my opponent's case. A few problems here. First is the Brapper turn. They're not answering this properly. Our argument is that Europe right now has a $500 billion infrastructure plan that's designed to compete with the Belt and Road Initiative, but work with it at the same time. We tell you this plan is better because they don't use debt trap diplomacy. My opponent, and we say this trades off because of limited funds within the European Union. My opponents say it's not Central Asia. It's about all of Asia, which means some of it must be for Central Asia. That's what I said in rebuttal. Second, they say that it's not about integration and how good it's going to be. Our argument is that the European Union is building up this infrastructure right now without China. If they collaborate with China on this infrastructure, it's uniquely worse because China uses debt trap diplomacy. That's why you can vote for us on their case.